My daughter-in-law always coveted our farm. After my husband died, she pushed me to sell, but I inherited it alone. One day I found his hidden diary. Never let her know what's in the barn. Curiosity won. When I unlocked the door, my world collapsed.
Before we continue, comment where you're watching from and subscribe to the channel. We'd love to see how far our stories are reaching.
Inside was something that would change everything I thought I knew about my family. But let me start from the beginning, when Victoria's true nature first revealed itself in ways I could no longer ignore. The sound of cars pulling into my driveway at 7 in the morning jolted me awake. Through the lace curtains that Thomas had given me for our 20th anniversary, I saw Victoria stepping out of her silver BMW, followed by two men in dark suits carrying clipboards and measuring tapes. My stomach dropped when I recognized the official look of real estate appraisers. I threw on my worn cotton robe and made my way down the creaking wooden stairs that had groaned under the same steps for 40 years. When I opened the kitchen door, Victoria was already measuring my front porch as if she owned the place. "Margaret, good, you're awake," she said without looking up from her clipboard where she was jotting down numbers. "These gentlemen are from Premium Realty. They're doing a preliminary assessment." "An assessment?" My voice came out weaker than I intended. "Victoria, I never authorized this." She finally looked at me with that smile I'd grown to despise over the past 6 months. It was the same smile she used when talking to Robert about what was best for me, as if I were a child incapable of making my own decisions. "Margaret, we discussed this yesterday, remember? You agreed it would be good to get an idea of the property value." Her voice was sickeningly sweet, theatrical. The men continued measuring as if I didn't exist. I had no memory of agreeing to anything. My mind felt foggy these days, but not that foggy. "I don't remember agreeing to—" "Oh, you know how it is at our age," Victoria interrupted, giving the appraisers a knowing look. "Memory isn't what it used to be. That's exactly why we need to start making practical decisions." One of the men looked uncomfortable, but the other nodded sympathetically. I felt heat rise to my cheeks. She was doing it again, making me seem incompetent in front of strangers. "Where's Robert?" I asked, wrapping my robe tighter around myself. He had to leave early for work, but he completely agrees this is the right move. "We're all worried about you living alone out here, Margaret. It's not safe for someone your age." Someone my age. I was 67, not 90. I still drove to town, maintained my garden, and managed the household finances Thomas had left in perfect order. But Victoria had a way of making me feel ancient and helpless. The appraisers finished with the porch and moved toward the barn. My heart skipped. "Wait, you don't need to measure that old thing. It's just storage." "Actually," Victoria said, consulting her notes, "barns can add significant value to rural properties, especially ones this size." She gestured toward the weathered structure that had stood on our land since before Thomas and I bought the place. "Some city folks love the rustic charm. They convert them into studios or event spaces." I watched the men walk toward the barn, and something cold settled in my chest. Thomas had always kept it locked, saying it was just full of old farming equipment we'd never use. But now Victoria was eyeing it like it held treasure. "I think that's enough for today," I said, trying to sound firm. Victoria's smile tightened. "Margaret, we're just trying to help you. You can't stay here forever. What if you fall and no one finds you for days? What if something happens to the house? You're all alone out here." The words stung because part of me feared them too. Since Thomas died, the silence in the house felt different, heavier, more permanent. Some nights I did worry about falling down those creaking stairs or having my old heart give out with no one around to help. "I'm managing fine," I said, but even to my own ears it sounded unconvincing. "Of course you are for now, but we have to think ahead." Victoria's voice took on that patronizing tone she used when explaining things to her 5-year-old daughter. "Robert and I have been looking at some lovely senior communities. Meadowbrook Manor has a beautiful garden, scheduled activities, medical staff on site. I don't want to live in a facility." "It's not a facility, Margaret. It's a community. You'd have friends your own age, organized meals, housekeeping services. No more worrying about maintaining this big old place." The appraisers returned from their examination of the barn, one of them making notes while the other took photos. They moved through my property like it already belonged to someone else. measuring the chicken coop where Thomas had raised prize-winning hens, evaluating the vegetable garden where I still grew tomatoes and beans. "We'll need to do an interior assessment next week," one of them told Victoria, handing her a business card. "Perfect. I'll arrange that with Margaret." She turned to me with false brightness. "Won't that be exciting? Finding out exactly what this place is worth?" After they left, I sat in my kitchen drinking coffee that had gone cold, staring out at the barn. Victoria's interest in it nagged at me. Thomas had always been secretive about what he kept in there, but I'd never pressed him. Now I wished I had. The phone rang, startling me from my thoughts. It was my neighbor, Helen, calling from 2 farms over. "Margaret, honey, I saw those fancy cars at your place this morning. Everything all right?" Helen had been my closest friend for 25 years. She'd helped me through Thomas's illness and death, bringing casseroles and sitting with me during the long, empty evenings. "Victoria brought some real estate people over. She thinks I should sell the farm." There was a long pause. "Sell the farm? Margaret, that place is your life. You and Thomas built everything there together." "She says it's not safe for me to live alone." "Bullshit," Helen said bluntly. "You're sharper than most people half your age. What's really going on here?" I found myself crying before I could stop it. "I don't know, Helen. Ever since Thomas died, Victoria's been different, pushy. She acts like I'm a burden, like I'm in the way of something. Have you talked to Robert about this?" "I've tried, but he always takes her side, says she's just looking out for me." Helen's tone suggested she had opinions about that. "Listen, Margaret, don't let anyone pressure you into anything. That farm is yours, and you have every right to stay there as long as you want." After we hung up, I felt a little stronger, but as the day wore on, my unease grew. Victoria returned around lunchtime, this time with a camera, taking pictures of my furniture. "Just documenting things for insurance purposes," she explained when she saw my expression. "And maybe for the estate sale when the time comes." "Estate sale? Well, you won't need all this furniture in your new place. Most of these pieces are antiques anyway. They might be worth something." She photographed Thomas's reading chair, the dining table where we'd shared 40 years of meals, the china cabinet that had belonged to his grandmother. Each flash of the camera felt like she was erasing pieces of my life. That evening, I called Robert at work. "Mom, Victoria told me about the appraisal. I think it's a good idea to know what the property's worth. But Robert, I don't want to sell. This is my home." "I know, Mom, but you have to be realistic. You're getting older, and that place is too much for you to handle alone. Victoria and I just want what's best for you." Victoria and I. When had those 2 words become so painful? When had my son started making decisions about my life with his wife instead of with me? What if I'm not ready to leave? Then we'll cross that bridge when we come to it. But having the information is smart, right? Dad would have wanted you to be practical about these things. Using Thomas against me felt like a slap. My husband would have hated the idea of strangers walking through our home, evaluating our life together like merchandise. After dinner, I sat on the porch watching the sunset behind the barn. The building looked innocent enough in the golden light, but Victoria's intense interest in it bothered me. What could she possibly know about it that I didn't? I thought about Thomas's last weeks, how he'd grown increasingly protective of that barn, checking the lock multiple times when he thought I wasn't watching. He'd always said it was just old farming equipment, but now I wondered if there was more to it. As darkness fell, I saw headlights turning into my driveway again. My heart sank when I recognized Robert's truck. He rarely visited on weeknights anymore, claiming work was too demanding. But as I watched him get out and walk toward the barn instead of the house, my blood ran cold. He had something in his hand. Tools, maybe. He went straight to the barn door and began working on the lock. I sat frozen on my porch, watching my own son trying to break into a building on my property. He fumbled with what looked like bolt cutters, glancing nervously back toward the house. The sight of him skulking around like a thief on his own mother's land made my chest tight with betrayal. When he finally gave up and drove away without even coming to say hello, I knew something was terribly wrong. Whatever was in that barn, Victoria wanted it badly enough to send Robert to steal it from me. That night, I moved Thomas's old hunting rifle from the gun cabinet to the bedroom closet. For the first time since his death, I felt truly afraid. Not of living alone, but of my own family. I didn't sleep that night. Every creak of the old house made me grip the rifle tighter. wondering if Robert would come back, or if Victoria would show up with more strangers to strip away pieces of my life. By dawn, I'd made a decision that had been 6 months in the coming. It was time to go through Thomas's belongings properly. I'd been avoiding his desk since the funeral. The mahogany piece had been his sanctuary, where he paid bills, read farming journals, and wrote in the leather-bound notebook he always kept private. Whenever I'd asked what he wrote about, he'd smile and say, "Just old man thoughts, sweetheart. Nothing that would interest you." But now everything interested me, especially anything that might explain why Victoria was so eager to get her hands on my property. The desk drawers opened easily enough, revealing the usual collection of receipts, insurance papers, and farming records. But the bottom drawer stuck, warped from years of humidity. I pulled harder, and when it finally gave way, the force sent me stumbling backward. Papers scattered across the floor, and among them were things I'd never seen before. Sketches, dozens of them, drawn in Thomas's careful hand. Pictures of me from when we were young, me hanging laundry on the line, me in our wedding dress, me laughing at something he'd said over breakfast 30 years ago. My hands trembled as I gathered them up. Thomas had been artistic? In 43 years of marriage, he'd never mentioned being able to draw. These weren't casual doodles either. They were skilled, detailed portraits that captured expressions I'd forgotten I'd ever worn. At the bottom of the pile was a leather journal, darker and more worn than any notebook I'd seen him use. When I opened it, his handwriting filled page after page, but not the neat script from his farming records. This was different. Sometimes hurried, sometimes careful, always passionate. March 15th. Started another painting of Margaret today. The light through the kitchen window turns her hair to spun gold when she makes her morning coffee. I think this might be the one that captures her spirit. Painting? I flipped through more pages, finding entries that went back decades. References to canvases, to colors, to artistic techniques I didn't even know Thomas understood. How had I lived with this man for so long and never known he painted? April 3rd. Finished the portrait of Margaret in her blue dress. It's the best work I've done, but like all the others, she can never see it. Not yet. Maybe someday when I'm brave enough to show her who I really am inside. My chest ached reading those words. Thomas had hidden an entire part of himself from me, not out of deception, but out of some kind of fear or shyness I'd never suspected. I turned page after page, finding references to paintings he'd completed, exhibitions he'd dreamed of entering, artistic dreams he'd kept locked away. Then I reached the final entries, written in those last terrible weeks when we knew he was dying. January 8th. The doctor says I have maybe a month. Need to make sure Margaret never finds out about the paintings. Victoria's been asking too many questions about the barn, about what we keep locked up. She's got that look in her eyes, the same one she had when she first saw the farm and asked how much land we owned. Margaret trusts her, but I don't. Never let her know what's in the barn. If something happens to me, the paintings are Margaret's legacy, not Victoria's opportunity. The words blurred as tears filled my eyes. Even dying, Thomas had been trying to protect me. But from what? What paintings? What was in that barn that Victoria wanted so desperately? I turned the page and found something that made my heart stop. A detailed sketch of the barn with annotations written in some kind of code. Numbers and letters that meant nothing to me, but clearly meant something to Thomas. He'd drawn arrows pointing to specific locations, marked measurements, noted what looked like hiding places. The final entry was dated just 3 days before his death, written in the shaky handwriting that still haunted my dreams. January 22nd. Too weak to write much now. Margaret, if you're reading this, I'm sorry I never told you. I was afraid you'd think I was foolish, an old farmer playing at being an artist. The paintings are in the barn. Everything I ever felt about you, about our life together, it's all there. Don't let Victoria find them first. She'll destroy them or sell them, and they were never about money. They were always about love. Below that, in handwriting even shakier than the rest, he'd written, "The key is taped under the last drawer. Barn. Emergency only." With trembling fingers, I felt around the bottom of the drawer until I found it. A small brass key held in place with electrical tape that had yellowed with age. The metal was warm in my palm, as if it had been waiting for me to find it. I sat on the floor, surrounded by Thomas's sketches, holding the key to secrets he'd kept for over 40 years. My husband, the man I'd thought I knew completely, had been an artist. Not just someone who doodled in his spare time, but someone who'd filled an entire barn with paintings he'd been too modest or too scared to show me. The phone rang, making me jump. Victoria's name appeared on the caller ID, and for a moment I considered not answering. But something about finding Thomas's journal made me feel stronger, more certain of my ground. "Good morning, Margaret. I hope you slept well after yesterday's excitement." "I slept fine," I lied. "Wonderful. Listen, I've scheduled the interior appraisal for this afternoon. I know it's short notice, but the men had a cancellation and can fit us in." "Victoria, I haven't agreed to sell the farm." "Of course not, dear. This is just information gathering. Knowledge is power, right?" Her laugh sounded forced. "Besides, I've already confirmed with the appraiser. It would be rude to cancel now." I gripped the key tighter. "What time?" 2:00. "And Margaret, make sure the barn is accessible. They'll need to evaluate all the structures." My blood ran cold. "The barn is just storage. There's nothing valuable in there." "Well, let's let the experts decide that, shall we? Sometimes these old farm buildings surprise people." After she hung up, I stared at the key in my hand. Victoria was pushing harder, getting more aggressive about accessing the barn. Whatever Thomas had hidden in there, she suspected its value. But I had one advantage she didn't know about. I now had the key. I spent the morning pacing the house, Thomas's journal clutched in my hands. Part of me wanted to rush out to the barn immediately, to finally see what my husband had been protecting. But another part was afraid. What if the paintings were terrible? What if I discovered that Thomas had wasted decades on a foolish hobby? What if Victoria was right to dismiss his artistic dreams? But then I remembered his words. They were always about love. At 1:30, I saw the appraiser's car pulling into my driveway, followed by Victoria's BMW. My heart pounded as I watched her get out, checking her watch impatiently. She was early, probably hoping to catch me off guard. "Margaret," she called, walking up to my porch with that false brightness she wore like armor. "Ready for the big reveal?" The appraiser was a different man from yesterday, younger, with kind eyes that reminded me of Thomas. When Victoria introduced us, he shook my hand gently and said, "Mrs. Patterson, I want you to know we'll be respectful of your home. This can be emotional, having strangers evaluate your possessions." Victoria's smile tightened. "Oh, Margaret's fine with it. She's very practical about these things. Aren't you, Margaret?" I wanted to tell him I wasn't fine with any of this, that this woman was bullying me into something I didn't want, but the words stuck in my throat like they always did when Victoria put me on the spot. Instead, I led them through the house, watching the appraiser make notes about my grandmother's china, Thomas's leather recliner, the wedding photos that lined our hallway. Each item he evaluated felt like another piece of my life being cataloged for disposal. "Now," Victoria said when we finished with the house, "let's take a look at that barn. That's really what could make or break the property value." We walked across the yard, and I felt the weight of Thomas's key in my pocket like a secret heartbeat. The barn loomed ahead of us, its weathered wood silvery in the afternoon sun. Thomas had built the addition himself 20 years ago, expanding what had been a simple storage shed into something much larger. Victoria went straight to the door and pulled on the lock. It stuck fast. "Do you have the key, Margaret?" Thomas always kept it locked. I'm not sure where the key is." "Well, we'll need to get in somehow. This is a major structure on the property." Victoria turned to the appraiser. "Is there another way to access it?" "Sometimes these old locks can be forced," he said, examining the heavy padlock. "Or we could call a locksmith." "No," I said quickly. "I mean, I'd rather not break anything. Let me look for the key." Victoria's eyes narrowed. "Margaret, yesterday you said it was just storage. If that's all it is, why does it matter if we break the lock?" I felt trapped, caught between protecting Thomas's secret and looking foolish in front of strangers. "It's just, Thomas was very particular about his things. I want to respect that." "Thomas is dead," Victoria said bluntly, and the words hit me like a slap. "He's not going to care about a broken lock." The appraiser looked uncomfortable. Perhaps we could schedule another time when Mrs. Patterson has had a chance to locate the key. That would delay everything, Victoria said, her voice taking on an edge I'd rarely heard before. We're trying to help Margaret make practical decisions about her future. She can't keep clinging to every little thing Thomas might have wanted. I stared at her, seeing something in her face I'd never noticed before. Hunger, desperation. Victoria wasn't just impatient. She was almost frantic to get into that barn. I'll find the key, I said quietly. Give me until tomorrow morning. Victoria looked like she wanted to argue, but the appraiser was already closing his notebook. That works for me, Mrs. Patterson. I'll come back tomorrow at 10. After they left, I sat on my porch holding Thomas's key and watching the barn in the fading afternoon light. Whatever was inside had been Thomas's greatest secret and Victoria's greatest obsession. Tomorrow, I would finally discover which one of them had been right to care so much about what lay behind that locked door. But tonight, I would read every word in Thomas's journal, trying to understand the man I'd loved for 43 years and apparently never truly known. I couldn't wait until morning. After reading Thomas's journal 3 times, absorbing every word about his hidden artistic life, I knew I had to see what he'd protected so carefully. At 4 in the morning, I pulled on my boots and coat and walked across the dewy grass to the barn, Thomas's key warm in my palm. The lock was old and stubborn, stiff from decades of weather and disuse. I had to work the key back and forth, remembering how Thomas had always carried a small bottle of machine oil in his pocket. I found it in the workshop, right where he'd always kept it, and after a few drops, the lock finally turned with a satisfying click. My hands were shaking as I pulled the heavy door open. The hinges groaned in protest, and then cool air washed over me, carrying a scent that made my heart stop. Turpentine and linseed oil, the smell of art supplies, sharp and distinctive. I fumbled for the light switch Thomas had installed years ago. When the fluorescent bulbs flickered to life, I gasped and stumbled backward, my hand flying to my mouth. The barn wasn't a storage space. It was a complete artist's studio, more sophisticated than anything I could have imagined. Easels stood at various heights throughout the space, some holding blank canvases, others with paintings covered by white sheets. North-facing windows had been cut into the barn wall to provide perfect natural light. Tables lined the walls, organized with brushes, palettes, tubes of paint arranged by color like a rainbow of possibilities. But it wasn't the studio itself that took my breath away. It was the paintings. Dozens of them hung on every available wall space. And they were all of me at 25, laughing as I hung sheets on the clothesline, my hair wild in the wind. Me at 30, pregnant with Robert, glowing as I tended the vegetable garden. Me at 40, reading in our old porch swing, late afternoon sunlight streaming across my face. Me at 50, kneading bread in our kitchen, flour dusting my apron. Every stage of our life together was represented in rich oils and delicate watercolors. Thomas had captured moments I'd forgotten I'd lived, private, intimate scenes when I'd thought no one was watching. But he had been watching, with the loving eye of an artist who saw beauty in the everyday. I moved through the barn like sleepwalker, stopping in front of each painting, recognizing myself, but also seeing a woman I'd never known existed. In Thomas's eyes, I was luminous, graceful, worthy of fine art. When I looked in mirrors, I saw an aging farm wife with calloused hands and laugh lines. But Thomas had seen something else entirely. In the center of the studio sat an easel with a larger canvas, covered by a sheet. My hands trembled as I lifted the cloth, and when I saw what lay beneath, I sank into the old wooden chair beside it. It was me as I am now, or as I was 6 months ago before grief aged me another decade. I was sitting in our kitchen, morning light streaming through the window, holding a cup of coffee and smiling at something off canvas. The painting was nearly finished, but I could see where Thomas's brushstrokes had become unsteady in his final weeks. He'd been working on it right up until the end, trying to complete this final portrait of the woman he'd loved for 43 years. Below the easel, on a small table, was another journal. This one was filled with technical notes about painting techniques, but also with more personal observations. December 10th. Margaret asked why I spend so much time in the barn. told her I was organizing the old farm equipment, hated lying to her, but how do I explain that I've been painting her for 20 years and she's still the most beautiful subject I've ever seen? December 22nd. Finished the painting of Margaret making Christmas cookies. Captured that little smile she gets when she thinks no one's looking. Someday I'll be brave enough to show her these. Someday I'll tell her that every morning I wake up grateful I get to see art walking around my house. I was crying now. Great heaving sobs that echoed in the empty barn. Thomas had loved me more deeply than I'd ever imagined, and I'd never known. All those hours he'd spent tinkering in the barn. He'd been creating a gallery of our life together, preserving moments of beauty I'd never thought to notice. Near the back of the barn, I found filing cabinets filled with correspondence, letters from art galleries in the city, from collectors, from museums. I pulled out a folder marked Inquiries and found dozens of letters dating back 15 years. One was from the Modern Art Gallery in the state capitol. Mr. Patterson, we've reviewed the slides of your work that you submitted for consideration. Your portrait series, Life with Margaret, shows exceptional technical skill and emotional depth. We would be honored to discuss a solo exhibition. Another was from a collector in New York. Your paintings capture something increasingly rare in contemporary art, genuine love and devotion to subject matter. I would be interested in purchasing the entire collection. Thomas had been offered exhibitions, sales, recognition for work I'd never known existed, but he'd turned them all down. In the margin of one gallery letter, he'd written in pencil, "Not ready to share her yet." I found a thick folder labeled Insurance Appraisal that made my knees weak. A professional art appraiser had visited 3 years ago, brought here by Thomas himself, and estimated the value of the complete collection at over $200,000. Some individual pieces were valued between $5,000 and $15,000 each. Thomas had been sitting on a fortune in artwork, and he'd never told me. Not because he was greedy or secretive, but because to him, these paintings weren't about money. They were about love made visible. About 40 years of marriage documented in brushstrokes and color. I understood now why he'd been so protective of the barn in his final weeks, why he'd made me promise never to let Victoria know what was inside. She would see dollar signs where Thomas saw devotion. She would see sellable assets where Thomas saw sacred memories. A sound outside made me freeze, a car door slamming. I looked at my watch and realized I'd been in the barn for 3 hours. Dawn was breaking, and someone was in my driveway. I quickly covered the central painting and turned off the lights, locking the barn behind me just as Victoria's BMW came into view. My heart pounded as I walked casually toward the house, hoping she hadn't seen me coming from the barn. "Margaret!" Victoria called, getting out of her car with unusual urgency. "You're up early." "Couldn't sleep," I said, which was true enough. "What brings you here so early?" "I brought coffee and pastries from town. Thought we could discuss your options before the appraiser arrives." She studied my face carefully. "You look different this morning. More alert." I probably did look different. Discovering that your deceased husband was a talented artist who spent decades painting love letters to you in oils and watercolors tends to change your perspective on a few things. I'm fine. Just thinking about everything that's been happening. Good. Thinking is good. Making rational decisions is what Thomas would have wanted. Victoria held up a bakery bag. "Shall we have breakfast and talk about your future?" I wanted to laugh at her presumption. She had no idea what Thomas would have wanted. She'd never bothered to really know him, had always treated him like a simple farmer who'd been lucky enough to own valuable land. If she'd seen his paintings, she still wouldn't understand them. She would calculate their market value and miss their emotional worth entirely. Over coffee and Danish pastries I didn't want, Victoria launched into her pitch about senior living communities and the wisdom of selling while the real estate market was strong. She had brochures, financial projections, and a list of practical reasons why I should abandon the home I'd shared with Thomas for 4 decades. "The maintenance alone must be overwhelming," she said, spreading papers across my kitchen table. "When did you last have the roof inspected? What about the furnace? The electrical system?" "These old houses are money pits, Margaret." I sipped my coffee and watched her performance, thinking about the paintings hidden just 100 yards away. She was so focused on what she thought the farm was worth that she had no idea what it actually contained. You've certainly done your research, I said carefully. Of course I have. Someone needs to look out for your interests. Victoria leaned forward, her eyes intense. Margaret, I need you to understand something. Robert and I aren't just thinking about your comfort and safety. We're thinking about your legacy, about what you'll leave behind. The word legacy hung in the air between us. If only she knew. What kind of legacy? Financial security for your family. Robert's been stressed about money lately. His job isn't as stable as we'd hoped, and we want to give the grandchildren the best education possible. Victoria's voice took on a wheedling tone. Selling the farm could solve all of those problems. There it was. The truth Victoria had been dancing around for months. She needed money, and she saw my farm as the solution to her financial problems. All the talk about my safety and well-being was just manipulation designed to make me feel guilty for standing in the way of her plans. I see, I said quietly. I knew you'd understand. You've always been so generous, so family-focused. Victoria smiled triumphantly. When the appraiser finishes his evaluation today, we'll have all the information we need to move forward. I thought about Thomas working in that barn for 20 years, creating masterpiece after masterpiece in secret. Victoria wanted to sell my legacy without knowing what it truly contained. She thought she was manipulating a helpless old woman, but she had no idea that she was sitting across from the subject of a priceless art collection. The appraiser arrived at exactly 10 o'clock, and this time Victoria was practically vibrating with eagerness to get to the barn. But I had the key, and more importantly, I now knew what I was protecting. Ready to solve the mystery of the locked barn? Victoria asked brightly. I smiled back at her, feeling powerful for the first time in months. Oh, I think we're all going to be very surprised by what we find. But the surprise would be mine to control, and the legacy would be Thomas's to give. I led Victoria and the appraiser to the barn, my hand steady as I produced the key. But instead of opening the door immediately, I paused, watching Victoria's face. She was practically holding her breath, her eyes fixed on the lock with an intensity that confirmed every suspicion I'd developed about her true motives. Before we go in, I said slowly, I want to ask you something, Victoria. How did you know this barn might be valuable? She blinked, caught off guard. I didn't know anything specific. I just thought, old farm buildings sometimes have antiques. Maybe some vintage equipment collectors might want. It was a reasonable answer, but something in her tone felt rehearsed. I turned the key and opened the door, but instead of revealing the art studio, I'd covered everything with old tarps and moving blankets during my early morning return visit. The barn looked exactly like what Victoria claimed to expect. Storage space filled with mysterious covered shapes. Well, the appraiser said, stepping inside and looking around. There's certainly a lot here. Mind if I take a look under some of these covers? Of course, I said, watching Victoria closely. The appraiser lifted a tarp from what had been one of Thomas's easels, now holding an old plow part I'd moved from the actual storage area. Victoria's face fell slightly. Not the disappointment of someone hoping for antiques, but the specific letdown of someone expecting something particular. We spent an hour uncovering farm equipment, old furniture, and boxes of everyday household items I'd strategically relocated. The appraiser was thorough but found nothing of significant value. Victoria grew increasingly agitated as each tarp revealed mundane objects instead of whatever treasure she'd been expecting. That's it then, the appraiser concluded, making notes on his clipboard. The barn adds storage value to the property, but there's nothing here that affects the overall appraisal significantly. After he left, Victoria lingered, walking around the barn with a puzzled expression. I could see her mind working, trying to understand where she'd gone wrong in her calculations. I should get lunch started, I said, but Victoria wasn't ready to leave. Margaret, are you sure Thomas never mentioned anything valuable being stored out here? Maybe something he inherited from his family? Like what? I don't know. Artwork, maybe? Didn't his uncle used to paint? The question hit me like ice water. How did Victoria know about Thomas's uncle? I'd barely remembered that detail myself. Thomas had mentioned it maybe twice in 40 years, saying his mother's brother had been an artist who'd died young and poor. How do you know about Thomas's uncle? Victoria's cheeks flushed. Robert mentioned it once. Just casual conversation about family history, But Robert hadn't known about his great-uncle either. I was certain of that, which meant Victoria had been researching Thomas's family, looking for connections to art or anything else that might be valuable. That afternoon, after Victoria left with obvious reluctance, I did something I hadn't done since Thomas's funeral. I went through his personal papers with a fine-tooth comb. In a file folder marked insurance, I found something that made my blood run cold. There were photocopies of legal documents, but they weren't in Thomas's careful handwriting. Someone had copied them, and recently. The dates on the copy machine stamp were from just 3 weeks ago. Pages from his will, his insurance policies, the deed to our property. Someone had been through our private papers and made copies. I knew exactly who that someone was, but I needed proof. I called Helen, my neighbor, and asked her to come over for coffee. Helen had been a secretary for 30 years before retiring, and she had a sharp eye for details that most people missed. "Margaret, honey, you sounded upset on the phone. What's going on?" I showed her the copied documents. "Helen, someone's been through Thomas's papers and photocopied them. The dates show it was done recently, while I was in town for my doctor's appointment." Helen examined the pages carefully, then looked up with concern. "Margaret, these copies include everything someone would need to understand the full value of your estate. Insurance policies, property valuations, even copies of your bank statements. This isn't casual snooping. This is systematic research. That's what I was afraid of. Have you given anyone access to these files?" I thought carefully. "Robert has a spare key for emergencies. And Victoria knows where we keep important papers. I showed her after Thomas died in case anything ever happened to me." Helen's expression darkened. "Sweetheart, I think someone's been planning this for a while. These documents would tell them exactly what your property is worth and what your financial situation looks like." That evening, I decided to test my suspicions. I called Robert at work, something I rarely did anymore. "Mom, is everything okay?" "I'm fine. I just wanted to ask you about something. You mentioned once that your great-uncle was an artist?" There was a long pause. "My great-uncle?" "Mom, I don't know anything about a great-uncle who was an artist. Where did that come from?" "Victoria said you'd told her about him." "Victoria?" Robert sounded genuinely confused. "Mom, I never told Victoria anything about Dad's family being artists. I didn't know anything like that to tell." My heart sank. Victoria had lied about how she knew, which meant she'd been researching Thomas's background independently. But why would she care about art connections unless she suspected there was art to be found? "Robert, I need to ask you something else. Have you or Victoria been in the house when I wasn't here?" Another pause, longer this time. "Why would you ask that? Just answer me, please. Victoria sometimes stops by to check on you when you're out. She worries about you being alone so much. Is that a problem? How does she get in? She has my spare key." "Mom, what's this about? You're starting to worry me." "Nothing, sweetheart. I just like to know who's been in my house." After we hung up, I sat in Thomas's chair, pieces of the puzzle falling into place with disturbing clarity. Victoria had access to my house. She'd been researching Thomas's family background. She'd made copies of our private financial documents. She'd lied about how she knew about artistic connections in the family. All of this pointed to one conclusion. Victoria knew or strongly suspected that there was valuable art somewhere on my property. But how? I spent the next hour searching through more of Thomas's papers, looking for anything that might have tipped her off. In his desk, I found a folder I'd missed before, labeled Art Supplies Tax Records. Inside were receipts for art supplies going back 20 years, organized by year, with meticulous records of every purchase: professional-grade paints, fine brushes, canvas, turpentine, thousands of dollars in art supplies over the years. If Victoria had seen these receipts, she would have known immediately that Thomas wasn't just dabbling in art. No one spends that much money on supplies without being serious about their work. At the bottom of the folder was a letter from an insurance company, dated 2 years ago, acknowledging receipt of a fine arts addendum to our homeowner's policy. Thomas had insured his paintings as valuable personal property. Victoria might not have seen the paintings themselves, but if she'd found these papers during one of her check-in visits, she would have known there was valuable art somewhere on the property. The barn would have been the obvious place to look. My phone rang, interrupting my thoughts. Victoria's name appeared on the caller ID, and for the first time in months, I felt ready for whatever manipulation she was planning to try. Margaret, I've been thinking about our conversation today. About the barn, I mean. What about it? Well, I was wondering. Thomas spent so much time out there. Are you sure you've seen everything he kept in that building? Maybe there are hidden areas or storage spaces that weren't obvious? Hidden areas. She was practically giving herself away now. Victoria, what exactly do you think Thomas was hiding in that barn? Nothing specific, I just think. Well, you know how men can be. They collect things, store things away, forget to tell their wives about family heirlooms or valuable items they've inherited. Thomas told me about everything important. Of course he did. But sometimes men don't realize something is valuable. They might keep old things that seem worthless, but are actually antiques, or family pieces that have historical significance. She was fishing desperately now, trying to get me to admit there might be something valuable in the barn without revealing how much she already suspected. Victoria, is there something specific you're looking for? No? Why would you think that? I'm just trying to make sure you get fair value for your property when the time comes to sell. Sometimes these old farms have hidden treasures that owners don't even know about. I appreciate your concern, I said carefully, but I think Thomas and I were pretty thorough about knowing what we owned. After she hung up, I sat in the gathering darkness, understanding finally how completely I'd been deceived. Victoria hadn't developed sudden concern for my welfare after Thomas died. She'd been planning this for years, researching our finances, learning about Thomas's family, looking for opportunities to access valuable assets I might not know about. The pressure to sell wasn't about my safety or her concern for my future. It was about her desperation to get her hands on whatever valuable art she suspected Thomas had been hiding. But Victoria had made one crucial mistake in her calculations. She assumed that if valuable art existed, I wouldn't know about it. She assumed I was just a simple farm wife who could be manipulated and deceived. Tomorrow I would show her exactly how wrong she was about that. I called Victoria the next morning and asked her to come for dinner. I've been thinking about everything you said, and I want to discuss my decision about the farm. Oh, Margaret, that's wonderful. I knew you'd see reason eventually. Her voice practically bubbled with excitement. Should I bring Robert? Yes, bring Robert. And Victoria? I'd like to have dinner on the porch tonight. The weather's perfect, and I want to watch the sunset over the barn one more time before I make my final decision. That evening, I set the porch table with Thomas's grandmother's china, the good silver, and candles in glass holders that would cast light toward the barn. I'd spent the afternoon carefully preparing, not just dinner, but the revelation that would end Victoria's manipulation forever. Robert arrived first, looking tired and stressed. He kissed my cheek and asked, "Mom, are you really ready to talk about selling the farm?" "I'm ready to talk about a lot of things," I said, pouring him iced tea in one of the crystal glasses I'd inherited from my mother. Victoria arrived 20 minutes later, carrying a bottle of wine and wearing a dress that probably cost more than I spent on groceries in a month. She was trying to look subdued and supportive, but I could see the excitement dancing in her eyes. "Margaret, you look lovely tonight. So peaceful. I can tell you've made the right decision." We ate dinner while the sun slowly set behind the barn, casting long shadows across the property. Victoria chattered about senior communities and real estate markets, while Robert mostly stayed quiet. I noticed he kept glancing at me with a worried expression, as if he sensed something was different but couldn't identify what. As the sky turned pink and gold, I stood up from the table. "Before we talk about my decision, I want to show you both something. Victoria, you've been so interested in that barn, so convinced it might hold something valuable. Tonight, I'm finally ready to let you see what Thomas kept locked away all these years." Victoria's fork clattered to her plate. "Margaret, you don't have to—" "Oh, but I do." I smiled at her, feeling calmer than I'd felt in months. "You've been so helpful, so concerned about making sure I understand the full value of my property. It's only fair that you see everything." I led them across the yard to the barn, Thomas's key warm in my palm. The evening air was still and quiet, broken only by the sound of our footsteps on the gravel path. "Mom," Robert said quietly. "What's in there that's got you both so worked up?" "Your father's legacy," I said, unlocking the barn door. The part of himself he thought no one would understand. I reached inside and flipped the light switches, all of them. The barn blazed with illumination, revealing the art studio in all its glory. I'd removed all the covers and tarps, arranged the paintings for maximum impact, and cleaned everything until it gleamed. Victoria gasped and stumbled backward. Robert's mouth fell open. "My God," he whispered. "Dad did all this?" I watched their faces as they took in the scope of what Thomas had created. Dozens of paintings covered every wall, each one a window into 40 years of marriage, seen through the eyes of a man deeply in love. The easels, the art supplies, the north-facing windows. Everything spoke of serious artistic commitment. Robert moved through the barn like he was walking through a cathedral, stopping in front of painting after painting. "Mom, these are incredible. I never knew Dad could. I never knew he saw you like this." But Victoria wasn't looking at the paintings with wonder or appreciation. She was calculating, her eyes moving quickly from canvas to canvas, probably trying to estimate values. When she spotted the folder of correspondence from galleries and collectors, she moved toward it with obvious intent. "Victoria," I said sharply, "don't touch that." She froze, her hand halfway to the folder. "I was just curious about how much they're worth?" I moved to stand beside the central easel, the one holding Thomas's final, unfinished portrait of me. "Or about why you've been so desperate to get into this barn?" The color drained from her face. "Margaret, I don't know what you're implying." "I'm not implying anything. I'm stating facts." I picked up another folder from the table beside Thomas's easel. "Let me share some interesting things I discovered while you've been pressuring me to sell my home." I opened the folder and pulled out the photocopied documents. These are copies of Thomas's private papers, his will, insurance policies, bank statements. They were copied 3 weeks ago while I was at a doctor's appointment. "Would you like to explain how copies of my private documents ended up in my kitchen?" Robert looked between us, confusion clear on his face. "Mom, what are you talking about?" "Your wife has been systematically researching our finances and family history, Robert. She knew about Thomas's uncle who painted, even though you never told her. She's been using your spare key to access my house when I'm away. She made copies of private documents to understand exactly what this property might be worth." "That's not true," Victoria said, but her voice lacked conviction. "Isn't it?" I pulled out more papers. "Here are receipts for art supplies dating back 20 years. Professional-grade materials worth thousands of dollars. Here's a letter from our insurance company about a fine arts addendum to our policy." If someone had seen these papers during an unauthorized visit to my house, they might reasonably conclude that valuable art was hidden somewhere on the property. Robert was staring at Victoria with growing horror. "Victoria, did you go through Mom's private papers?" "Robert, you don't understand. She's been living alone, getting confused about things. I was just trying to help. By researching Thomas's family background? By copying legal documents? By lying about how you knew things you shouldn't know?" Victoria's careful composure finally cracked. "You want to know the truth? Fine. Yes, I suspected there might be valuable art here. Thomas spent thousands on art supplies over the years. I saw the receipts when I was helping organize things after the funeral. Any reasonable person would wonder where all that artwork ended up. So you decided to manipulate me into selling so you could get your hands on it. I decided to help an elderly woman make practical decisions about her future." Victoria's voice rose, losing the sweet tone she'd maintained for months. "You're sitting on a fortune here, Margaret. These paintings could be worth hundreds of thousands of dollars, and you were just going to let them rot in a barn." "They weren't rotting," Robert said quietly, still looking around at his father's work. "They were exactly where Dad wanted them to be." Victoria whirled on him. "Robert, don't be naive. Your father was selfish, keeping all this to himself when it could have secured our family's financial future. Do you know how much we've struggled while he was hoarding valuable art?" "Hoarding?" The word came out of me like a whip crack. "Thomas created these paintings over 20 years, Victoria. Every single one is a love letter. He wasn't hoarding them. He was protecting them. From people exactly like you." I moved to stand in front of the unfinished portrait, the one Thomas had been working on until his final weeks. Do you see this painting? Thomas was trying to finish it when he died, not because he wanted to sell it, but because he wanted to capture one more moment of the life we built together. Robert was studying his father's final work, tears in his eyes. He really loved you, didn't he, Mom? More than I ever realized. And he knew someone would try to turn that love into money if they could. Victoria looked around the barn with desperate eyes, probably calculating lost opportunities. Margaret, you can't keep all this locked away. It's selfish. These paintings should be in galleries where people can appreciate them. You mean where you can profit from them. I mean where they can benefit everyone. Your grandchildren's education, Robert's career, our family's security. Thomas is dead. He doesn't need these paintings anymore. The callousness of her words hit me like ice water. Get out. What? Get out of my barn. Get off my property. I moved toward her, and for the first time since I'd known her, Victoria actually stepped back. You spent months making me feel like a helpless old woman. You manipulated my son, invaded my privacy, and tried to steal my husband's legacy. Get out before I call the sheriff. Margaret, you're being irrational. Mom's being rational for the first time in months, Robert said, his voice hard. Victoria, I think you should leave. Robert, you can't be serious. I'm your wife, my wife who's been lying to me for months. My wife who violated my mother's privacy and tried to manipulate her out of her home. Robert looked around the barn one more time. My wife who saw all this beauty and only thought about money. Victoria's mask finally fell away completely, revealing the calculating woman underneath. You're both making a huge mistake. These paintings could change our lives. They already have, I said quietly. They've shown me exactly who you are. After Victoria stormed out, slamming her car door and spraying gravel as she drove away, Robert and I stood in the barn surrounded by his father's life work. Mom, I'm so sorry. I had no idea she was doing any of this. I know, sweetheart. She fooled me too, for a long time. He moved from painting to painting, really seeing his father for the first time. What are you going to do with all this? I looked around the barn that Thomas had filled with love made visible. I'm going to do what your father intended. I'm going to protect it, appreciate it, and decide in my own time how to share it with the world. And the farm? The farm stays with me. This is where I belong, Robert. This is where your father's work belongs. No one's going to pressure me into leaving again. As we walked back to the house under a sky full of stars, I felt lighter than I had in months. Victoria's manipulation was over. Her lies were exposed, and Thomas's legacy was safe. But most importantly, I had my son back. 3 months later, I stood in the barn watching my grandson Tommy carefully mix colors on a small palette. At 8 years old, he had Thomas's patient concentration and his father Robert's kind eyes. The afternoon sun streamed through the north-facing windows, illuminating the easel where Tommy was working on his first real painting. Grandma Margaret, is this the right shade of blue for the sky? He asked, holding up his brush. What do you think, sweetheart? Does it look like the sky outside? He considered this seriously, then added a tiny bit of white to his mixture. Grandpa Thomas always said painting was about seeing, not just looking. My heart swelled. Tommy had never met his grandfather, but through the paintings and the stories I shared in our weekly art lessons, he was getting to know the man who would have adored him. The Thomas Patterson Art Foundation had been officially established 2 months ago, with the barn converted into a teaching studio where local children could learn art for free. We'd kept most of Thomas's original paintings on the walls, but now they shared space with colorful works by young artists discovering their own creativity. Robert had helped me set up the foundation, working with lawyers and accountants to ensure everything was properly organized. He'd thrown himself into the project with an enthusiasm I hadn't seen since he was Tommy's age, as if connecting with his father's artistic legacy had awakened something in him that Victoria had tried to suppress. Mom, the reporter from the art magazine is here, Robert called from the barn entrance. I looked up to see a young woman with a camera and notebook, her eyes wide as she took in the studio space. Sarah Chen from Arts and Culture Quarterly had contacted me after hearing about the foundation through the local paper. What had started as a human interest story about a widow discovering her husband's secret art had grown into something much bigger. "Mrs. Patterson, this is incredible," Sarah said, moving carefully through the studio. "When I heard about your husband's work, I wasn't expecting anything this sophisticated." Over the past months, I'd learned that Thomas's artistic abilities were far more significant than even he had realized. The gallery director from the state capitol had driven out personally to see the collection, and his assessment had been stunning. Thomas's portrait series wasn't just technically accomplished. It represented a unique documentation of love and marriage that captured something increasingly rare in contemporary art. "He painted me for 20 years, I explained, watching Tommy work. "Every stage of our marriage, every season of our life together. He saw beauty in the everyday moments that I thought were too ordinary to matter." "And you had no idea he was creating all this?" "None at all. Thomas was modest about everything he did. He probably thought no one else would understand why an old farmer spent his evenings painting portraits of his wife." Sarah photographed some of the paintings, focusing on the progression from early works showing me as a young woman to the final, unfinished portrait that still sat on Thomas's original easel. I'd completed that painting myself over the past months, working slowly and carefully to blend my brushstrokes with his. The result wasn't technically perfect, but it was emotionally complete, a collaboration between us that transcended death. "Have you considered selling any of the work?" Sarah asked. "I've sold 3 pieces to collectors who understood their significance." The proceeds went directly into the foundation, funding supplies and scholarships for young artists who can't afford private lessons. I watched Tommy step back from his easel to evaluate his progress. But most of Thomas's work stays here, where he intended it to be. The foundation had attracted attention from art educators across the state. We'd had inquiries from universities wanting to document Thomas's techniques, from museums interested in temporary exhibitions, from other small communities hoping to replicate our model. But the heart of everything remained the Saturday morning classes where children like Tommy discovered that art was about seeing the world with loving eyes. After Sarah finished her interview and left, I helped Tommy clean his brushes while Robert organized supplies for the next week's classes. "Mom, I got the divorce papers today," Robert said quietly. Victoria had left town 6 weeks ago, after it became clear that Robert wasn't going to forgive her manipulation or ignore what she'd tried to do to me. She'd moved back to her parents' house 3 states away and filed for divorce, claiming irreconcilable differences. In her version of events, she was the victim of a family that couldn't appreciate her practical approach to financial planning. "How do you feel about that?" I asked, relieved, mostly, and guilty about feeling relieved. Robert sat down on one of the wooden stools Thomas had built for the studio. "I keep thinking about all the warning signs I ignored. All the times she was cruel to you and I just went along with it to keep the peace. You can't blame yourself for trusting someone you loved. I can blame myself for not protecting you better, for letting her make you feel unwelcome in your own son's life." I set down Tommy's clean brushes and turned to face Robert fully. "Sweetheart, you were being manipulated too. Victoria was very good at what she did. She made you think her concerns were reasonable, her suggestions practical." "Grandma, can I paint you next week?" Tommy asked, looking up from his work. "Like Grandpa Thomas used to do?" "I would love that," I said, remembering how Thomas had always claimed his best paintings came from subjects he loved. That evening, after Robert and Tommy went home to their apartment in town, I sat in the barn reading through letters from the families of children in our art program. Parents wrote about kids who'd never shown interest in creative activities suddenly spending hours drawing at home. Teachers reported improved confidence and problem-solving skills in students who'd been struggling academically. But the letter that meant the most to me came from Helen Rodriguez, whose granddaughter Maria had been one of our first scholarship students. Maria's parents worked multiple jobs and could never have afforded private art lessons, but the 12-year-old had shown remarkable talent in our Saturday classes. "Mrs. Patterson," Helen wrote, "Maria came home last week and told me that art class was the best part of her whole week. She said you told the children that everyone sees the world differently, and that's what makes art important. She's been drawing everything. Her little brother, our cat, the flowers in our yard. But more than that, she's been looking at everything differently, like you taught her the world is full of beautiful things if you know how to see them. Thank you for giving her that gift." I thought about Thomas. working alone in this barn for 20 years, never knowing that his careful attention to beauty would eventually teach children to see their own world with artists' eyes. He'd created his paintings as love letters to me, but they'd become something larger, inspiration for a new generation of young artists who learned that ordinary life could be transformed by loving observation. The barn phone rang, interrupting my thoughts. It was Robert calling from home. "Mom, Tommy wanted me to tell you something before bedtime. He said to tell you that he figured out why Grandpa Thomas painted so many pictures of you." "Oh? What's his theory?" "He said Grandpa must have known that someday Tommy would want to learn about his grandma when she was young, so he painted a whole story about your life together. Tommy thinks Grandpa Thomas was making sure future grandchildren would know how much he loved you." After we hung up, I walked through the barn one more time, looking at Thomas's paintings in the soft evening light. Tommy was right, in the way that children often are about the most important things. These weren't just portraits. They were a record of a love story, painted in oils and preserved for generations who hadn't been born yet when Thomas first picked up a brush. On Thomas's easel, the painting we'd finished together caught the last rays of sunlight. In it, I was sitting in our kitchen, morning light streaming through the window, smiling at something beyond the frame. Thomas had painted me looking toward a future I couldn't see, but that he'd hoped would be filled with the same love and beauty that had inspired his art. Victoria had seen valuable objects where Thomas had created priceless memories. She'd seen real estate opportunities where I saw home. She'd calculated profit margins where my husband had documented devotion. But in the end, her greed had led to her own downfall, while Thomas's love had created something that would outlast all of us, a foundation that would teach children for generations to come that the world was full of beauty worth seeing, worth capturing, worth sharing. I turned off the barn lights and walked back to the house where I'd lived with Thomas for 40 years. Tomorrow would bring more art classes, more young eyes learning to see beauty in ordinary things, more evidence that love made visible could inspire others to create their own lasting legacies. Thomas's paintings would hang on these walls for as long as I lived, and after that, the foundation would ensure they continued inspiring young artists who understood that the most valuable things in life couldn't be bought or sold, only shared, with open hearts and loving eyes. In the quiet of my farmhouse, surrounded by the life Thomas and I had built together, I finally understood what his legacy truly was. Not the paintings themselves, but the vision they represented, the radical idea that ordinary love, carefully observed and faithfully recorded, was the most precious art of all.